wanted to be introduced.
I don't know if it's still got my maiden name. I actually took my wife's last name when we got married. She hated my old last name, so I was like, well, I'll just take yours.
Okay, so you want me to say Christopher VanHall?
Yes, please.
Okay, here we go. Take 2. Hello, welcome back to Who's Your God. Our guest is here. It's Christopher VanHall.
Yes. Hello. I think 2 people is a new record for the amount of applause I've ever gotten before. So
no way. Come on. With those hot sermons you're cooking up every Sunday. So just for a little bit of background, we are doing a very special video edition, which will be available on our Patreon, so that Christopher can also use it for his podcast. But I just want to give the background on how we met. We did our friend's podcast about beer. We'll get into why, because you own a brewery. And because we have Who's Your God, he thought like, oh, let's put them together. And I just thought your story was so interesting. And I thought Steve would think it was interesting as well as our listeners. So, we talked about having you on. I'm so glad it finally worked out.
Me too.
Great.
What's your podcast about, Christopher?
So I've got a podcast called Revved Up Theologics, and really it's just talking about like culture and politics and how different things intersect, specifically with like contextual biblical understanding of Christianity versus what it's become. Lots of hot topics, specifically about how evangelicalism is usually fucking things up, and that's what we do. So
do you, as somebody, you are a minister, do you find like sometimes getting caught up in the politics of the thing? Do you think that kind of sometimes it takes away from you being able to like take a step aside and to think eternally as well?
So for me personally, I used to think that way. I was very much so like anti-politics from the pulpit, even when I became more progressive. But the more I studied scripture from cover to cover, even with the Old Testament, the more I realized that a lot of these authors were making very political statements for their time. They were making very political, activist-oriented movements for their time, the Gospels included. So I used to believe that the Gospels were meant to be anti-political, but now I'm pretty sure it's one of the most political messages that I've ever read.
And it's so funny now that we're talking to, and I've read your book, by the way. Christopher has a great book called Reborn Again. It only came out in 2019, right?
Yes, just a couple of years ago.
And it's a perfectly like concise argument for progressive Christianity, progressive political Christianity. You mentioned in your book very early on books like Blue Like Jazz and Velvet Elvis, which anybody, I think we must be around the same age. How old are you?
I'm 36.
Oh no, you're what the fuck?
It's the beard and aging.
No, just the way you were describing all the things. But I guess it could have worked that way as well, because I remember when Blue Like Jazz and Velvet Elvis came out as well, and how like shattering, like a life altering they were for, I think, a certain amount of Christians that knew that the direction of the white evangelical church was not going in the correct place. And your book talks about your evolution in terms of Christianity, but it also, like I said earlier, concisely like talks about some of the big hot button issues that American evangelicals bring up, usually in opposition to progressive causes as well. This book's great, man. I read everything. I've read a lot of shit, and this is the perfect book to put in the hands of somebody who is leaning progressive but still believes in Christ. Now, before we get into all of that shit, because I really do want to talk about all of it, and like I said, there's so much I want to talk about your book.
Of course.
What do you define what does a relationship with God look like to you right now?
So
And this has changed pretty drastically in the last couple weeks, right?
it has. Well, it hasn't changed in the last couple weeks, but it has changed probably within the last year. But I did make it public a couple weeks ago.
So
Right.
late April, it changed dramatically.
It sure did. Well, at least, I honestly think my congregants and the people that follow us on social media, they probably had a pretty good clue. I left little breadcrumbs,
You didn't get a
for
COVID
while.
fever or something and then stop believing.
Yeah. So it's, for me, I just define myself as spiritually agnostic. I'm not credentialed enough in any field to say whether or not there is or is not a divine creator of the universe. And part of me hopes that there is, and part of me hopes that there isn't, because I've got really tough questions for that God too, if that God does exist. But for me, I define myself as a Christian ethically, because I still find value in the moral teachings of the gospel and what we know for sure happened surrounding the life of the historical Jesus. That is something that I can align with. And I think it's an important message for today, because there's a lot of parallels between the Roman occupation and American history. So ethically, I align as a Christian. Spiritually, I'm agnostic / atheistic. It depends on what day you ask me. So
Now, how do you like when you're talking to people about Christ, and even I've gathered from your book that it's all very action orientated, which I do believe, if you know the teachings of Christ, he was telling people to do specific things, especially when he talks about the kingdom is within you. He wanted things to happen right now. I know that modern Christians oftentimes talk about the afterlife and all this shit, but at no point does Christ really ever talk about that stuff at all. With all of that said,
not at all.
Yeah, with all of that said, and we're going to go back to some of this stuff. Do you feel it's your job to talk about Christ, to convince people of that Christ isn't God, or the deity of Christ, or the virgin birth, or the crucifixion, some of these main tenets of Christianity? Do you feel at this point, and I didn't really gather it in your book, but I am wondering, with this sudden change in you, do you feel that you need to speak against these things? Do you feel like they get in the way of like living like the kind of life that you feel that Christ would really want us to live?
I think a lot of them do, because evangelical Christianity looks diametrically opposed to the movement that Jesus started. I mean, part of the problem is, as you mentioned before, like Christians have created this afterlife-centric theology, right? Where everything's about what happens next and not about what's happening around them. And that couldn't be, more different than the message that Jesus was teaching. When Jesus spoke of heaven and hell, it was a metaphor for here and now. He spoke about like, hey, there's hell, there's someone in need, and that need is not being met. This is heaven when you meet that need. It was never about this get out of, life card that God was handing out. And what the church has done, I think, is they figured out a way to ritualize complicity. So when people are upset about the injustices they see in life.
I know, I'm writing down ritualize complicity. Oh, I like that one, Christopher.
Love that.
I think what they've done is, when we see things that are unjust politically in this world, the church tends to subdue their congregants, and they tend to kind of pacify them and just say, but when, Jesus comes back, there's not going to be police brutality, and there's not going to be climate crisis, and there's not going to be disease in countries that don't have access to medication that's, available on every street corner here. And I think what that's done, it's created armchair Christianity. And I don't think that's what Jesus intended. I think Jesus was dealing with very real political issues of his day. I think his protesting of those very real political issues of his day is what landed him on a cross. That's what he was publicly executed for, this movement. And Jewish peoples get a lot of blame for that, because anti-Semitism has made its way into Christian theology, but it was Rome that killed Jesus, not the Jewish people. And it was because Jesus was constantly saying, hey, these people are fucked up. I'm paraphrasing. That's not in the Bible. But
in your book, you do say that you think God and the main teachings of Christ and the main teachings of God, and I'm going to paraphrase, but you can say it better than me, but he is basically opposed to any power structures that this is the sole reason why God exists, is that he is against any power structures that take advantage of people.
Exactly. I think that the divine, from the Hebrew Bible, the Jewish text, onto the Gospels and the New Testament, I think people were creating a divine creator that yearned for justice, because what they saw was power structures with different gods that only benefited those that are in power, right? And so they were creating a God that wanted to uplift them out of poverty and injustice, and that's not exclusive to Christianity. I mean, if you look at the story of Moses, it was all about liberation from a corrupt empire. And that's the one consistent theme that you see throughout the text is liberation from empire, from cover to cover. What you don't see is a consistent theme on things like sex, and you don't see abortion mentioned at all, and you don't see marriage mentioned or anywhere in context where it would condemn any sexual identity. Yet those are the values that the church is known for having, not being pro-socialism and equity and anti-imperial value.
And you think that happened when Rome took over Christianity?
Absolutely. I personally think that the moment Rome nationalized the Christian movement is the moment that it really started to do tremendous harm to peoples around the world. And I think you could probably look back to that moment and see how white supremacy and genocide and slavery all came from that infusion between empire and the Christian faith, because the Christian faith was growing tremendously at an exponential rate to the point that it terrified Rome. They thought they were going to lose power. And empires are brilliant. What Rome did is, instead of killing all the Christians because they were growing too fast to kill them all, they decided, you know what, we're gonna adopt this faith. We're gonna shed our clothing. We're gonna take on a new skin. And they converted all the temples for Jupiter and Mars and things like that to temples of the saints. If you look at a modern day traditional style Catholic service, there's a lot of elements that resemble ancient Roman worship services. None of them resemble an early Christian worship service at all. I mean, Christianity didn't exist when Jesus was around until hundreds of years later, right? Jesus was Jewish. But so many, you say that and people immediately label you a heretic because they're not taught that from their pulpits on Sunday. They're taught this gospel that never was.
There's a funny story in your book where you mentioned you came when you were a minister. You ministered at mega churches and such. You were a worship pastor, and there's a funny story that when you talked about when you investigated that they didn't really like sing songs. That worship doesn't mean what praise. That what doesn't mean what we think it means anymore.
Yeah.
Tell everyone what worship really is or was to the early church.
So worship to the early church was service to the poor. It was doing the work of social justice in your community. It was sharing your excess with your neighbor. That's biblical worship. And I had built my entire career working for these Six Flags Over Jesus churches, and being a pseudo U2 concert on Sunday mornings. And here I am, expected to give a presentation on praise and worship, and then I discover in that research for said presentation that what I knew as worship isn't biblical.
And that's what you ended up presenting?
Yes. And
Did you get fired?
Yes. Yes. It went over about as well as you would expect. So, I mean, I don't know. I mean, who would have thought that challenging their entire identity would have gotten me terminated? I don't know. No.
Yeah, well, it's funny. We're talking about the Romans, but then American evangelicals. I mean, I think like that version of the Christian church really found a beautiful partner in American individualism, because it's we are people that are used to, we like to be pacified and live by this sort of list of inactions, basically, like if I avoid doing all these things and live by these ideologies, my reward will be in heaven. We love to be lazy. We love any reason not to take action and focus on ourselves as American evangelicals. And it's just, I mean, I love how much we ran with it.
It's totally been co-opted by the American capitalistic agenda. Like, I think a lot of people think they worship a Christian God, but what they really worship is capitalism.
Definitely. And I mean, the church reinforces that, and especially in the megachurch world, it's constantly reinforced that everything is about money more than service.
Absolutely.
And songs, of course. And ripping it up on your Yamaha drum set.
we don't do video. We don't get access to these kind of visuals usually. You know?
I know. It's so true.
You knew the Holy Spirit showed up when the fog machine kicked in. That's when.
There's a very interesting, you're going to find this interesting, Amy, theological issue that you have is with the Trinity. So you don't believe in the Trinity either, right?
No, and it's not.
Damn, Chris.
I don't. So there's reasons for that. So if you go to any seminary, and by the way, this is not some new heresy that I'm talking about. This is stuff that's been taught in seminaries for well over a century. But pastors don't like to bring that back to their congregations because they don't want to stir the pot, because like the situation with the megachurch, they're smart enough to know that if they stir the pot too much, they're going to get fired. See, I wasn't smart enough to realize that at the time, but they don't want to get fired, and so they keep this information kind of hidden from their congregants. And the Trinity is not mentioned. The word Trinity cannot be found anywhere in the Scripture. It's not there. The early Judaic people were a monotheistic group of people. They believed in one God. And the term Messiah, even for Jesus, is not exclusive to the New Testament. There were kings. There was even a Persian king that was not Jewish that was called a Messiah because he liberated the Jewish peoples from their from the person that had colonized their region. So they called him a Messiah, and they called David a Messiah. Messiah just means savior. It means liberator, but not in a divine sense, but in a tangible sense. What they thought Jesus was going to do, they thought Jesus was going to come in with an army that was going to have an uprising and retake the Roman Empire and give the lands back to these tribal folks that had their land stolen. It was not a Son of God type of biography, the Gospels. It was a liberation movement.
Now, are we sure? And we're speaking like I'm just speaking purely theologically. Are we sure that he didn't want to do that? I mean, are we sure that he just didn't get the opportunity to do that?
I know that Jesus definitely wanted to liberate people from Rome, and yeah. I think Jesus had a different approach other than a military response to Rome, because he was smart enough to know that if there was a military uprising, they were outmatched as far as weapons were concerned, and the efficiency of the Roman army was concerned in every way, shape, or form. There have been violent uprisings in that region for centuries, and they all failed because there's this giant impact. I mean, it would be like these MAGA folks that think they can resist the American military with their AR-15s. It's like, you realize the American military has drones, right? And they have smart bombs. Your AR-15 ain't going to stop a tank or a Panzer. Like that's the kind of mindset that a lot of uprisings have had over the years is, oh, we can retake our country, and then they find out they can't. So I think Jesus was starting a subversive revolution and a nonviolent revolution simply because you can grow that kind of movement more effectively. And in some ways, it kind of won. But then again, the ideals of empire, hijacked it for its own selfish ambition, right? But I do think Jesus had every intention to overthrow the Roman Empire, just not in a violent way.
All right. So let's get a little personal here. How long did it take for you to come to this conclusion that you would call yourself an agnostic/atheist?
Well, so I started out when I was 16 or 17 years old, which is why I read those books, Blue Light Jazz and Velvet Elvis, when I was so much younger.
See, so I was like 24 and I was reading those books. Mm-hmm. That's what threw me off. So that makes me even actually laugh that a 16-year-old was reading Blue Light Jazz.
Well, I think I was 18 at the time when it came out, but I was honestly ready to walk away from the church at that point because I had done the research about worship and realized that none of this was biblical. So I was just kind of ready at that point to be done.
At 18 years old, you were
at
ready.
18, I was ready. I was like, you know what?
And you had already
I'm
been
done.
working in the church for a while.
Yeah, had been working in the church. Not that I think I was done with Christianity at that point, but I do think I was done with the church at that point. And then I had read Velvet Elvis and Blue Light Jazz, and it just gave me a sense of hope, even though the theological beliefs in those books by today's standard aren't that radical. Back then they were. I mean, this was...
Yeah, I remember you mentioned that in your book too, that there's in 2019 or 21, there's no way you could look at this stuff and say like, oh, you know, for someone to say, hey, I don't think this person's going to hell, probably. What a huge deal that was.
I think,
but they were huge.
Yeah, they were huge. I think Rob Bell was just like, hey, y'all, what if Mary wasn't a virgin? And everybody was ready to crucify the dude in Velvet Elvis. But I read the books and it gave me a lot of encouragement. And a point that Rob Bell made was that we can be a part of the problem or we can be a part of the solution. And that's what keeps him in the church. And I think that's what's kept me in, but my hunger for like biblical contextual truth did not go away. And I just kept doing more research. And the more research I found to be historically accurate, the more progressive I became over time. And this has ultimately led me to a place where I can say with full confidence that I'm not confident in the integrity of the compilation of scripture at all. I am confident that these books were written by an author for a specific time, and they were discussed in Jewish sanctuaries for the Old Testament, and they were spread about the early church. I know that they existed. You know, I don't think the church just made these documents up like some people assert. But as far as like how they were compiled and the additions that were made within each book are concerned, I just don't have a lot of faith, you know, that this was meant to be taken literally. I think there was definitely an agenda behind the compilation of scripture that Empire used.
So why, I mean, how much longer are you going to feel compelled to keep pointing back to the scripture?
Well, you know, I have pointed back to ethical teachings in The Lord of the Rings for as long as I can remember. I've pointed back to ethical teachings in mythology for as long as I can remember. Just because something isn't literally true doesn't mean that it doesn't possess truth, right? I think there is an incredibly rich anthology that we call the Bible that has lots of ethical beauty within its text. I don't think it's literal, but that doesn't mean that I don't believe it's powerful.
And is there anyone else from the scripture aside from Christ that you find yourself looking to, like in the same way you look at Gandalf?
Oh, man. I find so many characters interesting. I find some characters that people adore in the church, like David, to be absolute assholes. I don't know why anybody reveres David. Was a garbage
with his
human
stupid
being.
Little rocks.
that was like the one time you saw anything remotely like kind of benign about David. David grew up to be this, you know, horrible human being, and his son Solomon was even worse. And those
do love them. I haven't really thought about it that much recently, but you're so right.
Solomon instituted a system of slavery.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm
no, go ahead, please.
I think sometimes, you know, we, like the church found it easy to cling to any character that was a child, just to, you know, I mean, it's like, oh, this is a great thing to feed children. He's a kid. Mm-hmm. You have bullies, and it's like, this is not actually the story of David. It's how to defeat your bullies with a rock. No. Like, yeah, he was awful later on.
Yeah. And let's tell this Game of Thrones style, like the Mountain versus what was his name with the spear? Gosh, I could have told you any other day. My nerd brain has farted. But anyway,
I don't think either of us watches it.
Well, there's these two characters that have the showdown, and it's kind of like a David and Goliath moment, but it's brutal, and it is not a kid's story. I actually don't let my kids read the Bible. It's not for kids at all.
Do you even have a kid version, like with just the stories, like?
No, I mean, Songs of Solomon alone is like 50 Shades of Yahweh is what I tell people. Like, this is one dude's sexual escapades with hundreds of women, and the church talks about it like it's the ideal love story. I mean, I'm not
For
exaggerating.
Steve, it is.
Yeah, and so he talks about the Song of Solomon's in his book.
Yeah.
And he does bring it up that, that's basically, polyamory or it's for sure non-monogamy.
Very much so.
But why do you didn't answer this in the book, but why do you think that whoever put together the Bible, they added Song of Solomon's in it?
I think people have liked sex for a really long time. And I think ancient peoples had a less stigmatized view of sexual activity. I think, they weren't as prudish as we are today. I mean, biblical marriage doesn't occur until after the relationship is consummated. And in, Jewish traditions, people still do this today. They take the chuppah, the chuppah, and they take it down and they take it to the bridal suite, and the husband and wife consummate the relationship on that tarp that was over them during their wedding ceremony. And then that's the moment for them that they're considered to be married. So Christians, though, have just totally twisted the value that ancient peoples had on sexuality.
Well, marriage is another thing that just married so perfectly with capitalism, too, because it's really just that you're joining assets. There's nothing Christian or really even romantic about it in many ways.
There's nothing romantic about it, and it's really hard to nail down a biblical definition of marriage, because when the text starts out, there's definitely polygamy going on with Abraham. By the time we get to Songs of Solomon, we have a patriarchal polyamorous system where men are allowed to have as many partners as they want, but women are expected to be virgins. Oh, and they're considered to be property too, which is horrific. And by the time we get to the New Testament, we see marriage become this monogamous system where women are still considered to be property. But most historians have concluded that monogamy was a Roman value, not an ancient Jewish value. So that was probably Rome inserting their values into the text. It did not emerge from the early Christian movement.
And this is also something, of course, that Joseph Smith really, a part of the Bible he really loved.
Oh, yeah.
And that, he basically formed this doctrine around and said, why would God make women so hot if he didn't want me to have as many as I wanted?
I mean, it's been twisted in so many ways to harm so many people. What I tell people is marriage is not consistent throughout the Bible. I hope any form of it that's biblically accurate never reemerges, because it's not wholesome. It's misogynistic. It's a terrible system. And that if sex and relationships, no matter how they present themselves, occur between consenting adults, whether they're poly or monogamous, or whether they're LGBTQ or they're straight, whatever, just the church needs to shut the bedroom door. It's been long overdue.
So let's make sure we have answered Steve's question of why Song of Solomon was ever included.
Yeah, because the empire chose to put it in there. So why would they choose to put it in there?
So I, have not found a good answer about that. It's one of the books that I think, I'm puzzled as to how it got there. And the only conclusion I can come up with is people really like sex. It's funny because so few Christians have actually ever read it. It's a very lewd book. That I used a verse from Songs of Solomon in a collegiate ministry because I was expected to add a Bible verse to it. Otherwise, it wasn't a biblical ministry that the church was doing. And we kind of pushed back against that. We were like, this is stupid. We just get together and play board games. We don't want a Bible verse associated with this gathering. That's dumb. The pastor made us do it. So as kind of a rebellious act, we chose Songs of Solomon 7:7, which says, your breasts are a tree, your legs are your legs are a tree, your breasts are its fruit. I will climb this tree and take hold of its fruit. And we made a stick figure logo climbing a palm tree, reaching up to grab two coconuts. And we didn't actually write the verse out. We just wrote Songs of Solomon 7:7. And our pastor loved it. He's like, that's a great verse for this ministry. I was like, you've never even read this. There's no way you have.
Feel like I'm walking around on a couple of tree trunks pretty often. I love that. That speaks to me.
Like the ants in Lord of the Rings.
So I mean, you've called yourself in your book that you're a church planter. I think another word that I think they would call that in the Bible, an apostle, right?
Different terms, yes.
Okay, but you're a
Do you
church.
have, sorry, Steve, do you have beef with the term apostle because of its connotations, or?
Oh yeah. I mean, people that go around saying God told me to tell you this, definitely question those people. Like, psychologists have labels for things like that.
I don't know. I'm pretty excited about the from the desk of Donald Trump. Finally, I can hear from him again.
Oh my gosh, it's ridiculous.
Tell us about your current ministry, because I do think that story is pretty interesting.
So what we've decided to do is focus more on an online worship service in our church. So we upload our sermons to our podcast every week. And it's
you were doing this pre-COVID as well?
Pre-COVID, we were doing it like for the live worship service. But what we found because of COVID, it's one of the few beneficial things I've experienced with the fallout of the pandemic, is that people really want online community because it's flexible with their schedule and they can participate at their leisure. And they also don't want the pressure of coming to church because they're triggered. They're deconstructing their faith. They've got a lot of issues that reemerge every time they walk through a sanctuary door. So we're kind of talking to people like us that are, interested in the faith, but they wouldn't identify as maybe Christian spiritually themselves. And that's what we've done with our church and with our assets that we had. We had a building and we sold it as a church, and our church bought a brewery, and now we brew beer and give 30 to 60% of the profits to local charities for social justice initiatives like the NAACP, like the Homeless Garden Project, like Planned Parenthood, like the LGBT Diversity Center that's local in town, and other environmental organizations that are local as well.
I love that so much, and it's really good beer, and I also love the subversiveness of it, because, if you just and we talked about this on the other podcast we did, but how this is a very spiritual act too, just, the process of taking wheat from the earth and turning it into something is very biblical to me. It's, something that monks have done for a long time. But also, I just love that you can make a beer good enough and the bottles look cool enough, which they do. The art on them is great.
Oh, the artist would love to hear that. She's feeling
awesome.
She was feeling inadequate artistically recently, and I was like, no, you're amazing. And she's real young, and so I'm gonna send this clip to her.
I like knowing that at some point, Christians might drink this beer and some of their money will go to Planned Parenthood, and they won't know it because they'll be happily buzzed on a great beer with beautiful art on the bottle. There's like it's sort of got it all. It's like a connection to the earth, and there's a subversiveness, and it's, there's political action behind it. I mean, it's just such a good idea for a church to do.
Yep. Unknowing evangelicals come and they drink beer that helps Planned Parenthood, and they're too ashamed to tell their pastors that they drank beer in the first place. It works out.
It's also great because most churches don't use their money to help poor people, right? Most people use the money to pay rent and to pay the big staffs, all their salaries and everything like that. Mm-hmm. But that has to be how you handle your finances. Had to be a big deal when you establish something like this. Mm-hmm. What are your methods, and how did you guys come up with them?
So when we had a building, when we had a sanctuary, and if there is anybody that's still in ministry that's trying to figure out how they can incorporate like-minded, values in their church as far as how they handle their finances, one thing that we did is we rented our space out at a very affordable price, and we're outside the Bay Area. Affordability is difficult, but we would rent out our worship hall and all the buildings that we had attached to it as a community center for nonprofits. So they would use our space. We would give it to them at an affordable price. Our building was paid off, so we didn't need to make, a ton of money, but it was enough to cover our overhead. And then on Sunday mornings, when people came to donate, which is rare in an area like this because so many people don't have excess money, right? But they would give their money to the church, and the church would write a check. 100% of that money went to local organizations like the NAACP and like the Diversity Center and other nonprofit initiatives. And we would have them present for us during our worship service what they were doing locally. And, even that is something I think every church can do. You can get creative on how to meet your overhead, and you don't have to have this, Corvette in your driveway and these Joel Osteen style homes. Like the fact that there was a hurricane in Texas and Joel Osteen's sanctuary was locked during that and was not a shelter was one of the most hypocritical things I've ever seen. But it was just a blatant representation of the horrible values that permeate in the church, right?
It's crazy how often those buildings sit empty and could be used for other things, and it feels like such a symbol of like a shell corporation, right? Like it just symbolizes the financial shadiness of so many churches and the selfishness. I mean, I remember I grew up a block away from my church. That's why I started going there. And it was always empty. And like, it was fun for us because we would go play on the playground. And then we have this giant playground that's right by our house and everything. But I even remember feeling as a kid, like, why is this empty all the time, aside from like 2 nights a week for a couple hours, and then most of Sunday? Maybe people have the occasional wedding or something, but why not, even rent it out to a whole other congregation? There's always this fear of like, what if someone comes through and steals stuff? I'm like, what are they going to take? Bibles? Don't you want that? Good. Then more people have Bibles. Like, lock up the fucking projector. Like, we don't have anything expensive in here. It's just, it's literally just an empty symbol of how selfish you are. So I love that idea of using the space for other things. It seems so simple and obvious. And so few churches do it. So few churches do it. And it's because they get a lot of pushback because people are scared the carpet's going to get dirty. And that kind of bullshit just really drives me nuts. We were privileged in that our elder board, our leadership team, never had a high value in the sanctuary. For us, church is a people, it's a movement, it's doing good work in the community. So when the building got really expensive to maintain, it was really easy for us to say, okay, we could take all the money that we're spending on maintaining this giant, structure and invest it in something that's going to generate, far more funding for local nonprofits than we ever could have. And what's great is we've kind of eliminated the decision between charity and leisure for our congregants, because so many would come and they would give $20, and then in a way they were kind of sacrificing their ability to go out and have a beer with their friends, and they're working 2 or 3 jobs. They really need that self-care of just, relaxing. So now they can come and relax and give to charity at the same time, and they don't have to choose between the two. That's really smart.
Now, if your goal isn't to make people accept Jesus Christ into their heart as their Lord and Savior,
which is our goal for you today.
I'm like, your goal is really to help the community and the people around you. What draws people to that?
What draws people outside of the Christian faith? I think a lot of people that are outside of Christianity really do see value in not being a dick and being a good human being. And because of that, I would say 70% of our church is atheist or agnostic, and the other, remaining 30%, maybe a small portion, identify as Christian, and the rest have kind of a spiritual but not religious approach. They have identified with multiple faiths. Is it the case that the bulk of your congregation grew up in or used to be more strictly evangelical Christian? We have a lot of ex-evangelicals in our church. I'm one of them. And we have a lot of people that are deconstructing their faith. And sadly, one thing that happens is that when you preach to people that they don't need church every week, eventually they listen, and then they stop coming to my church every week, which kind of it's self-limiting. I'm like, no, I meant their church, not ours. But in a way, I kind of feel like they have moved on from feeling guilty about not attending a worship service every week. We've kind of liberated them from religious baggage in a way. So we're kind of like hospice for people that are spiritually dying. We're never going to have a big church, but what I do like is that people that have moved on from attending on a weekly basis because they felt like they needed to, I think from an outside perspective, they're in a better life position now. Like they feel like they don't have the weight of the world on their shoulders. And that's a good thing. I think the community service portion of it too is
so many of us, in theory, want to help a lot more than we do. And I often do this thing where I go on volunteermatch.org, and then I feel very overwhelmed about where to go and what to do. And even having that structure of this is an organization that has whispers of a feeling of a church that I might have grown up with. And so it has that nostalgia without necessarily the trauma being triggered. But also that I have these tangible things I can do in my community and things that I can give to, and that they've been vetted. And, we have these charitable partners. I think that piece of it is so smart. It's exactly what every church should be doing, and that's the goal. And it's so crazy how little that happens, because especially in an evangelical megachurch, the amount of money that's in there, and probably a lot of people that do want to help and don't have the encouragement to, or the structure, and saying it's all just give your money to the church. It's never we're working with this organization and we want you to support them. And I think people just having those tools to know how they can help and where in a manageable way is huge.
I think so too. I think one of the things that well-meaning churches, because there are good churches out there, it's not like I'm the only one, that would be far from true. There are really good progressive churches out there, and that are doing
and there's a lot in the Bay Area.
A lot in the Bay Area. They're doing really good work. The one common thread I see with many of them is that they're recreating the wheel. They see a need in their community, and they're like, okay, people are hungry. Let's make a food pantry here, rather than supporting people that honestly do it better than we ever could, because they've been doing it for so long and they have a volunteer base that's huge. What a lot of those nonprofits have in common that are already doing the work is they need money. So what we figured out a way is how to get financial support to them so they can do what they already do better.
Right. It's the difference between let's take 15 people down to Mexico to build this one house or this one church, and let's, as a congregation and a community with money, support, the causes that protect immigrants' rights and lives. Sometimes, and I think a good mixture of both is sort of my ideal church, where it's did I love it when I was 16 and hammering these nails and, and building a house in Mexico? Sure. I felt so noble, but I think a mix of the two of specific action, and it's there is still a selfishness to it. It's I feel good because I'm helping. I think it's not a terrible selfishness of all the different kinds of narcissism we have. I think so. Do you guys also have activities where you sort of go out or pre-COVID, I guess, go out in a community way and really help in a hands-on situation?
Yeah, in the before times, we would go out and volunteer with those organizations that were doing projects. So maybe there was a beach cleanup that we could go do, and we do have a few congregants that did start ministries that weren't really they were needs that weren't being met in the community. So we have a feeding program on Sunday because there wasn't a free meal being done in our county on Sunday, and our church fronts the bill for the food, and we have congregants that go and make the food, and they pass out life-saving medication like Narcan, and for people that are using, and they also they connect people to resources locally that are doing good work. So we help finance that, and we also participate in marches like our Martin Luther King Day Parade, Pride events. There's a Majesty LGBT inclusive drag show that happens, and they always, invite our church, and we go and we support that community. We actually have leaders in our church that are part of the burlesque troupe there, and so it's
my kind of church.
and they're awesome folks. And the one thing that has really emerged, from setting up our church this way is our leadership has members that are out in the community that are participating in burlesque for these, LGBT inclusive drag shows. They're doing work with local LGBT youth, that are doing environmental work, that are doing work for those that are experiencing homelessness and those that are recovering from addiction or still experiencing addiction. So it's definitely, kind of a mix of both. We don't really support mission work globally, other than sending people checks that specifically give the money to locals in other countries. We have participated with those kind of endeavors, but we don't send money like for people to travel to other countries, mainly because what we hear back from missionaries is the locals say just what you were talking about, Amy. They're like, well, yeah, you guys built one house, but we could have built 30 of them, with the same amount of money it took you to come here. So
yeah, and people who know how to hammer and not this weak 16-year-old fat girl. Get it done a little quicker.
Yeah, they definitely, have told us that they appreciate just having the money circulate in their own local economy too. So I guess if you were taking a macro view of how we do mission work, that's how we roll.
And when you're out in the community, or when you do like your weekly day of feeding the community, is there any ministry piece to that? Like, at any point, are you like trying to recruit people or save them in any way?
No, we're trying to serve people, and I think that's ultimately the teachings that I see that are consistent throughout the Gospels too. There's verses that talk about not praying in public and not doing these religious acts in public, but just go out and do good. Like there's a quote, it's one of my favorite quotes in church history, and it says, "Preach the gospel when necessary, use words." Live it out. That's the best thing you can do for people.
So I guess you have to, it takes, it's so funny to be a minister in this way, because you're just resigned to the fact that usually there's like a hero element to it. Did you have to let that part of yourself die at any point? Because even you're saying like, I'm doing my job if these people stop coming a lot of times.
Yeah.
that's got to be like, I guess in the most Christian way, it's good, but to me, that's just not any way that any minister I've ever encountered or met thinks.
Mm-hmm. There was definitely a lot of ego that had to die. There was a lot of deconstruction that had to be done that still needs to be done. I'm still working through the baggage that I collected from my tenure in ministry for the past 20 years. But honestly, it's fulfilling now. It's much more beneficial for me personally to just let that part of me die and not feel like this person that needs to come in, with this white savior complex, and I need to save, the community from eternal damnation and save people from being unaware of the teachings of Jesus and save people, from experiencing things that I have no idea what it's like to go through. Like, instead, I get to join them and, listen to them and participate how they would want me to. And we build more genuine relationships that way. I have more genuine conversations with people now than I ever did as an evangelical, because everybody was scared to tell me what they were going through because they were terrified I was going to judge them. And I would have, because that's what I was taught to do.
And you had your own fears at the same time. This is
Exactly.
part of the reason that Steve left his ministry, is that he felt like he wasn't being honest, because he was doing these things on the side. And it was like, how can I tell people not to do this stuff and then do it myself? So there's just walls up on both sides.
Absolutely.
You've also, because of the way that you've structured the church and the brewery financially, you've made a choice that you're never going to be rich from being a pastor.
No.
Which
Luckily,
is so un-American of you.
I am blessed. I do have a sugar mama. My wife works at Stanford, so we make she makes all the money. So I do have that benefit there. But even if I didn't, before we were married, I lived in a little studio micro apartment and had resigned myself to never, becoming super wealthy. And I don't say that to project a message that ministers shouldn't be taken care of. If they're good ministers, like the ones we mentioned before, that do exist, especially in the Bay Area, I think they should be paid a livable wage. I am fortunate enough to be a part of a denomination called the Disciples of Christ that sets a precedent for how much a minister can make. Which is you cannot ever make more than the local high school principal makes. If you make more than the local high school principal makes, then you are making too much money. You can make a living as a principal, but you're never going to get rich. And I think that is a standard that should be adopted by every church. You should have your needs met, absolutely, if you're doing the work, but you should not be rolling up in Bentleys, having your own fucking private jets. Like, that is disgusting.
Yeah.
He tells a funny story. He lied to his wife, Amy, the first few dates they went on. Or no, the first time they were talking for a few days. He didn't tell her that he was a minister.
No, man. That never went
Did
well.
you say you were a musician or a brewer or something?
So what I told her was that I had 2 jobs. I said,
I'm a drummer, number one.
those are actually the church drums. If anybody wants to buy these, we don't have a church building anymore. I'm just I don't play drums anymore. I'm just sitting in my office. But they look cool on video. They look like, I'm way cooler than I am. But I told my wife at the time, I was a musician. I do play guitar and I loop and I sing. And I told her, I was like, I could tell you one of my jobs, but I can't tell you the other. And immediately she was getting Breaking Bad vibes. She was like, this guy cooks meth, totally, with the beard and everything. Or she thought I was like a secret agent or works for the government or, did something illegal. Like I was like, I don't know, selling drugs or, she had all these ideas about who I was that are just way more intense than who I am. The reason why I didn't tell her is because when you tell people that don't know progressive spirituality or Christianity exists, and you say, hey, I'm a pastor, they totally change who they are. They apologize for saying fuck. And I'm like, fuck that. I say fuck all the time. And they won't drink around you. And they'll just start like treating you like you're a walking confession booth. And I don't like that because I never get to know people for who they really are. So when I meet new people, it doesn't happen as much locally anymore because I've been here for a while. But if I'm traveling and they ask what I do, I'm like, oh, I do a little bit of this, a little bit of that. I never tell them. And I'm not trying to be mysterious. I just want to really get to know them. So my wife was clueless when we first met. She goes into this bar, it's packed, and we were like, well, we don't have any seats here, but there's a place down the street. I was like, we can ride together. I got my Prius out front. And she goes, okay, cool. And she jumps in. And one of the things that has always been a gift in my ministry from congregants is crucifixes, which is weird because it's a symbol of execution. Like if you're going to give somebody something, like why would you give something? It'd be like me giving you an electric chair on a necklace. It's just so weird. But I appreciate the intent behind it. So I used to hang them on my rearview mirror. So I just had tons of crucifixes there. That were gifts.
Too many. I mean, 2 is too many.
There must have been 12 of them. So my now wife, then first date, looks in the mirror to kind of check her makeup and sees these crucifixes and is mortified because she was agnostic at the time and totally opposed to Christianity. And I get in the car and I go to look at her and I'm like trying to check her out. And she just looks terrified and I see her glaring at the rearview mirror. And I was like, oh shit. And she goes, you're not religious, are you? I was like, no, fuck that. I'm not religious, but I am a pastor. And we had a really interesting conversation. She listened and only tried to run away 3 times, and I begged her to let me finish. I'm not like those assholes. And
you're like, I learned from the Songs of Solomon that you need to stay with me.
And I've read it several times. No, she's great, and she would still identify as agnostic, but a Christian ethically as well.
Since you've been together?
Since we've been together, she did not come to church until after she and I had been engaged for a while. But when she did, it was a really refreshing experience for her because she didn't know anything outside of really conservative, judgmental churches. She had really traumatic experiences with the church growing up. So that's been nice for her. And what I would encourage any clergy that may be listening, that are progressive, that have, congregations, but they're scared to talk about these hot button issues, talk about them. Like so many people would be refreshed and liberated if you just chose to stop coddling the extremist in your church. Like this whole, let's all get together and welcome everyone, even if they're racist assholes thing. I guess if you're a white person, that sounds nice. But in effect, what you're doing is you're creating a space that isn't safe or welcoming for people that are good people and that I think would find home and community in the church.
Well, that actually leads us to our final question. We asked this of all our guests. It's so funny because I think you might be one of our first pastors, though. But
Wow.
the question is, if you were to have your own church
Or religion.
what would 3 tenets of that church or religion be? It could be practices as well, too. Anything that makes people feel centered, closer to God.
I
Number
think
one.
number one would be justice. That would be the tenet that I would have. The second,
What does that mean to you?
for me, it would mean that everybody has access to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's spelled out in our founding documents that sadly is still not realized. I would say justice.
So I asked that for personal reasons too. I am obsessed with justice, but in many ways, I often conflate that with fairness,
Mhm.
which is something that doesn't really exist. And also, I have to remind myself that I'm not necessarily like deserving or entitled in any way to personal fairness.
Mhm.
And so that's why I ask, like, what specifically that means to you, because it's something I care a lot about, but I always have to, it's work to separate it from this individualistic and sometimes capitalist version of what I think justice is. So I think, boiling it down to really just people deserve to not be killed and be able to eat and be happy.
Yeah. People deserve to experience life, and we have the resources for everyone to have an abundant life experience. We just don't share them. But then my second tenet would be equity, because we do have some reconciliation that needs to happen in our history. Equality sounds awesome for everybody. I think most people can get on board with that. Where people of privilege, from my experience in the church, have a kind of a hang up is when you start saying, and we need to lift up the people that we've oppressed for so long too. So equity until it's no longer necessary, which is going to take a long time, would be a second tenet of mine. And then the third.
So you support reparations, financial reparations?
Absolutely. 103,000%. Period. I think that's absolutely necessary. And the other thing would be conservation. I think we're destroying our blue boat home, our paradise in the universe, and we've got to do something to fix that, not just for ourselves, but for countless other cohabitant species in this world.
Yeah, I've watched a couple of your podcast clips, and you do talk a lot about climate change, which I really appreciate. I felt like that was not something when I was growing up in the church, and even living in the Bay Area, that occasionally our church might do like a beach cleanup, which is nice, but it's also like we don't want trash on the beach because we like to go to the beach. It was sort of divorced from like the greater issue. Mm-hmm. And any talks of sort of environmental work or climate change were really discouraged. And I think partially because if you're living a life that your goal is heaven, and you think the earth is going to be destroyed anyway, then why not speed up the process, essentially?
Yeah. It's sad. That problem, I think, stems from a very poor reading of Genesis. People read Genesis chapter 1. Firstly, it's problematic. They read it like it's a history book or like a scientific document. Major problem.
It's not.
It's neither.
Right? Okay.
It's a metaphor. It's a metaphorical poem. So God did not make the world in 6 days, did not create humanity from dirt and a rib. It's a metaphor. And it was read as a metaphor before Christianity got a hold of it.
But women are sneaky. That part's true.
So are men, though. And they're just less ashamed because of privilege about sneakiness. They're just assholes. Sometimes I can say that because I used to identify as one. But I would say the other issue is when it gets to the verse where it talks about Adam being presented with dominion over the birds of the air and over everything that crawls and all of these things. Dominion implies stewardship in the original translation of the Bible. It does not imply rulership. And a mistranslation of that word has led us to the climate crisis that we're all experiencing now. Because if I had to point a finger as to who's to blame, it's the church, 100%.
Yeah, which includes, factory farming and all these things, and literally, I literally remember pastors telling me that it was okay to eat meat because of that verse in the Bible. Because we own the animals, we own the earth, so if we want to farm them and eat them, that's fine. And it's pretty crazy the impact that the current day evangelical church, positive impact they could have on climate change, that they just choose not to care. It's, add it to the list, but.
Absolutely. And it's antithetical to the teachings of ancient Judaic peoples. They definitely believed that this planet was a gift and it was their home, and they didn't believe they were going somewhere else. What they did believe it was that God was going to restore this world, and God was going to use them as participants in that restoration. So they were kind of co-creators of heaven on earth. That's what they believed. Now, I don't believe that's literal, but I do believe that's powerful. If we can view ourselves as co-creators of paradise, then what that implies is it's time to get to work.
I love it. Okay, well, so we should say, and we'll plug this in the beginning and in the show notes, but the brewery is called Greater Purpose Brewing, and for the time being, you can only get that by being in Santa Cruz, right? You don't do mail order beer or anything yet. Working on it.
And if folks want to check out my book, it's Reborn Again, Crucifying Christendom and Resurrecting a Radical, and Revved Up Theologics is our podcast.
And how can folks join your online church if they want to check it out?
We've got several options depending on their preference. Podcast, I assume most of your listeners probably would be in that camp. So check out Revved Up Theologics for listening. Or if you want to actually view it live, we project our sermons live on YouTube every week, Sundays at 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. So you're definitely able to jump on there.
And how do they find that?
Just type it in your search bar, Greater Purpose Community Church on YouTube, and our videos should pop up. And you could, not to be too cliche, but you can smash that subscribe button, and it'll notify you when those sermons go live.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Christopher. This has been awesome.
Yeah, it's been great. Thank you for having me.
Don't hang up.